the night they took him, he wasn't praying. He wasn't reading scripture. He wasn't even thinking about God. He was 16 years old, sleeping in his father's house on the western coast of Roman Britain, and by morning he was in chains on a boat heading toward a country he'd never seen. 6,000 miles from everything he knew. 6,000 miles from his name, his family, his future. And here's what nobody talks about when they tell the story of Saint Patrick. He said it himself, in his own words, written in his own hand. One of the only documents we have from that entire era, written by a man about his own life. He called it his Confessio, his confession, and in it, he said something that should stop you cold. He didn't deserve to be saved. He believed, genuinely believed, that what happened to him on that boat was deserved. That God had allowed it because he had turned away. Most people hear the word saint and picture someone who always had it together, someone who prayed before meals and never raised his voice. That is not Patrick. Patrick was a mess. A beautiful, furious, broken, eventually luminous mess. And the reason his story still matters, not as folklore, not as holiday trivia, not as a reason to drink green beer, but as a living blueprint for anyone who has ever had their life taken apart without their permission, is because of what he did with the pieces. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before we get to the message he left, we need to understand what the snakes actually were. And I promise you, it's not what you think. Patrick spent 6 years as a slave in Ireland, tending sheep on a mountain called Slemish in what is now County Antrim. Alone, cold, hungry most of the time. No community, no books, no priest, no sacraments, no one to talk to. 6 years of that. Imagine that silence, not the peaceful kind. The kind that presses on your chest at night and asks you questions you can't answer. The kind that makes a 22-year-old man feel like he's already old. But something happened on that mountain. In the Confessio, Patrick writes that he would pray sometimes 100 times a day. 100 times. In rain, in snow, before dawn, after dark. He writes that the love of God and the fear of God came to me more and more. Not as a theological concept, not as Sunday school information, as something alive, something that kept him warm when the cold was physical. Now here's where it gets interesting, and where most retellings completely miss the point. Patrick wasn't a naturally religious man. He says explicitly that before his captivity, he had been lax in his faith. His grandfather was a priest. His father was a deacon. Christianity was in his house, not in his bones. He knew the words without the weight behind them. Sound familiar? A lot of people in America right now are sitting in that exact place. They grew up around faith. They have the vocabulary. Maybe they went to church every Christmas and Easter. Maybe their grandmother had a Bible on the nightstand. Maybe they can quote a verse or two. But there's a difference between faith as furniture and faith as fire. Patrick didn't discover God in a library. He discovered God in a place with no roof, no walls, and no way out. That matters. Hold on to that, because it connects to the snakes, and the snakes connect to you. And by the end of this, you're going to understand why Patrick's greatest miracle wasn't driving anything out of Ireland. It was what he drove out of himself. Think about the worst thing that ever happened to you. Not the inconvenient thing. Not the embarrassing thing. The thing you don't say out loud. The thing that rewrote your sense of who you were. The thing that made you feel, at least for a while, like the version of you that existed before it was gone forever. Patrick had one of those. He had it at 16, and he carried it for the rest of his life. But here's the open question I want to leave with you right now. Something we're going to come back to. Patrick eventually went back to Ireland, the country that enslaved him, voluntarily, on purpose, with a mission. Why would a man do that? What kind of transformation makes you walk back into the place that broke you? Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but out of love. That answer is the message, and we're going to get there. First, let me tell you about the voice. After years on that mountain, Patrick hears a voice in his sleep. It tells him, "Your ship is ready." He's never been to the port it's referring to. It's 200 miles away. He runs. He doesn't pack. He doesn't plan. He just runs. And when he gets there, the ship is waiting. The sailors initially refuse him, then change their minds. He gets on board and eventually makes it back to Britain, back to his family, back to what should have been the rest of his life. And he could have stopped there. He could have taken the trauma and filed it away, built a new life, pretended Ireland was a chapter that was done. A lot of people would have. Most people do. But the voice comes back. Years later, and this is straight from his Confessio, this is Patrick's own account, he dreams of a man named Victoricus coming from Ireland, carrying letters. And in the dream, one of the letters is for Patrick. He begins to read it and hears the voices of the Irish people calling out to him, "We ask you, holy boy, come and walk among us again." Holy boy. That's what they called him, the people who had enslaved him. Let that land for a second. Patrick wept when he woke from that dream. He says so. He didn't immediately obey. He wrestled with it. He trained. He was eventually ordained. He pushed back against the church authorities who didn't trust him. And there's a whole story there about a friend who betrayed him, and a sin from his adolescence that was used against him to try to disqualify him from the mission. We'll get to that, because that betrayal is actually one of the most human parts of the whole story, and it speaks directly to something a lot of people are carrying right now. But here's what I want you to feel in this moment. Patrick didn't go back to Ireland because he was fearless. He went back because the call was louder than the fear. That is a completely different thing. Fearlessness is a personality trait. Courage is a choice you make in spite of what you feel. He was afraid. He was unqualified. He was haunted by his past. He went anyway. Now, the snakes. The legend says Patrick stood on a hilltop called Crow Patrick and drove all the snakes out of Ireland. In one dramatic gesture, the island was cleansed of every serpent. It's a great image. It's also, almost certainly, not literal. There's geological evidence that snakes never actually lived in Ireland after the last ice age. The country was isolated before snake populations could re-establish themselves. So the miracle of the snakes was never about snakes. It was about what snakes have always meant. In the Celtic pre-Christian tradition, serpents were symbols of the old powers, of chaos, of death and rebirth, of the spiritual forces that operated outside divine order. In Jewish and Christian symbolism, the serpent in the garden is the original voice of fear, of shame, of the lie that says you are not enough, that God is withholding from you, that you need to grab what you can because no one is coming to provide. And in Patrick's personal mythology, his actual lived experience, the snakes were the interior forces that kept people in spiritual bondage. Idol worship, yes, but also hopelessness. The belief that you were defined by what had been done to you. The lie that said suffering was the last word. Patrick drove those out, not with a theatrical gesture on a hillside, but with decades of patient, dangerous, deeply personal work in a country that had every reason to reject him. He was beaten. Multiple times. The Confessio records it plainly. He was held captive again, briefly, by a local chieftain. His converts were harassed. Property was confiscated. There were death threats, and through all of it, Patrick kept writing, kept preaching, kept building communities, kept ordaining local men and women into service. A particularly Celtic move, by the way, one that the Roman Church was not entirely comfortable with. Patrick didn't build a hierarchy. He built a network, small, decentralized, embedded in the landscape. Monasteries that became centers of learning, prayer, hospitality, art. The Book of Kells was created in this tradition. the preservation of classical learning through the early medieval period, what Thomas Cahill famously called "how the Irish saved civilization," flows directly from the movement Patrick started. But here's the thing that gets me. The thing that connects all of this to you, sitting wherever you are right now, maybe skeptical, maybe curious, maybe carrying something heavy that you haven't told anyone about. Patrick's greatest theological contribution wasn't a doctrine, it wasn't a policy, it wasn't even a prayer, though the Lorica, the Breastplate of Saint Patrick, is one of the most powerful pieces of spiritual writing in the entire Celtic tradition, and we'll look at that. His greatest contribution was a way of seeing. He saw the sacred in the ordinary. He saw the image of God in the faces of the people who had enslaved him. He developed, and this is deeply Celtic, this is the heartbeat of the tradition, a theology of presence. The idea that God is not distant, not behind a wall of ritual and hierarchy and Latin you don't understand. God is in the wind at your back, in the light ahead of you, in the stone under your feet, in the person across from you who looks nothing like you and wants nothing to do with what you're selling. Patrick didn't go to Ireland with a polished message and a strategic rollout plan. He went with a wound that had become a window. That's the difference between religion and transformation. Religion can be performed. Transformation leaves marks. And this is where I want to ask you something directly. If you're watching this channel, you're probably not here by accident. You're looking for something. Maybe it's connection to a Celtic heritage you can feel, but can't quite articulate. Maybe it's a faith that has more grit in it than what you've seen in polished Sunday morning presentations. Maybe you've been through something that broke the previous version of you, and you're trying to figure out who comes next. If that's you, stay with this, because we're about to get to the part that I think is the actual message Patrick left. The one that's been waiting 1600 years to land on exactly the right person, at exactly the right time. But first, that betrayal I mentioned. It's in the Confessio. Patrick writes about it carefully, with obvious pain still present in the words even across the centuries. He had a close friend, someone he trusted more than almost anyone. A man he had confided in, had told in confidence about a sin he had committed as a boy before his capture, before any of his spiritual formation had taken hold. A youthful failure. Something he was deeply ashamed of. And this friend, when Patrick's enemies wanted to disqualify him from his mission, when the church leaders were looking for a reason to keep him out of Ireland, this friend handed them that secret. Used it as a weapon. Patrick was probably around 60 when he wrote the Confessio. The betrayal had happened decades before, and you can still feel the shock of it in the text, the disbelief, the grief of it. But here's what he doesn't do. He doesn't spend the Confessio arguing for his own innocence. He doesn't build a legal case. He doesn't name his betrayer or seek public vindication. He writes, and this is extraordinary, that through that experience God showed him who he really was. Not the idealized version, the real one. Small, scared, dependent, genuinely in need of grace rather than just familiar with the concept. The betrayal didn't disqualify him. It deepened him. And his enemies were wrong. Patrick went to Ireland anyway. The mission moved forward. And the friend who betrayed him, we don't know his name. We don't know what happened to him. History swallowed him. Patrick endured. This is a pattern. This is not a coincidence. This is something you can observe across the entire arc of Patrick's life. The thing that was designed to stop him became the thing that prepared him. His slavery prepared him for loneliness and endurance. His loneliness prepared him for prayer. His prayer prepared him for courage. His courage prepared him for betrayal. His betrayal prepared him for genuine humility. His genuine humility prepared him to walk into a pagan culture and be received not as a conqueror, but as a brother. Every single obstacle was load-bearing. Think about what you've been calling an obstacle in your own life. The thing you've been asking God, or the universe, or whatever word you use for the force that holds everything together, to take away the thing you're angry about, the thing you're exhausted by? What if it's load-bearing? What if the capacity you're going to need for the most important thing you'll ever do is being built right now, in exactly the place you least want to be? I'm not saying suffering is good. Patrick never said that. He called his captivity a punishment, but he also called it a gift. Both things at the same time. That's not contradiction. That's the kind of complexity that only people who have actually been through something understand. Now, the Lorica, the breastplate of Saint Patrick, formerly called the Lorica, from the Latin word for armor. Whether Patrick wrote every word of it in its current form is debated by scholars, but its theology is so deeply consistent with everything he wrote in the Confessio that the spiritual DNA is clearly his, and it opens like nothing else in Christian literature. I arise today through the strength of heaven, light of sun, radiance of moon, splendor of fire, speed of lightning, swiftness of wind, depth of sea, stability of earth, firmness of rock. This is not Roman Christianity. This is Celtic Christianity. This is someone who spent 6 years outdoors, on a mountain, praying in weather, who came to understand the presence of God, not as an abstraction, but as something woven into physical reality. The wind was not just wind. The rock was not just rock. These were the textures of a divine presence that permeated everything. And the prayer wasn't an escape from the physical world. It was an immersion in it. Then it shifts. It becomes personal and ferocious. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise. This is not asking for protection from a distance. This is claiming a presence so complete, so surrounding, so interior, that there is literally no direction a threat could come from that would not first have to pass through the presence of the living Christ. It is the prayer of a man who had been taken, who had been alone, who had been betrayed, and who learned through all of it that the one thing that could not be taken was the one thing that actually mattered. That prayer has been prayed by people in prison cells, by missionaries facing execution, by parents sitting with sick children at 2 a.m. with nowhere left to go, by soldiers, by addicts on the bathroom floor, by ordinary people in ordinary desperate moments who needed something more than a self-help strategy. It works because it's not asking God to fix the situation. It's claiming that God is already in it, already ahead of it, already surrounding it from every angle. That is Patrick's theology in concentrated form, and it came not from a seminary, but from a mountain in Ireland, where a 16-year-old slave had nothing left to lose, and found out what was left when everything else was gone. Here's something I want you to sit with for a moment. We talk about faith like it's a feeling, like it's something you either have or you don't. Like some people are just wired for it and others are left out in the cold. Patrick demolishes that entire framework. He was not born with extraordinary faith. He was manufactured into it. Slowly, painfully. Through repetition in conditions that were objectively terrible. 100 prayers a day, he says. Not because he felt them, because he needed them. There's a difference. He prayed his way into faith the way an athlete trains into strength. Not because it feels good, but because the alternative is weakness when weakness costs everything. If you've been waiting to feel faith before you act on it, Patrick's life is a direct challenge to that approach. You don't wait for the fire. You strike the flint. You keep striking. In the rain if you have to. In the dark if you have to. On the mountain if you have to. You will be surprised by what ignites. Before we get to the final piece of this, the actual message Patrick left, The one that lands differently when you understand everything we've just covered. I want to ask you something. If this is connecting with something real in you, if the Celtic spiritual tradition feels like a language you've always known but never been taught, consider staying close to this channel. This is the first piece in something larger. We're going to go deep into Patrick's world, into the theology of place, the practice of Celtic prayer, the history of a faith that survived empire and persecution and managed to stay warm through all of it. Subscribe, hit the bell, because the next piece builds directly on this one, and I don't want you to miss where this is going. Now, the message. Patrick left Ireland something remarkable, not just Christianity. Christianity was coming to Ireland one way or another. What he left was a particular version of it, a version shaped by his biography. He left a faith that believed in the holiness of the outsider, because he had been the outsider. He left a faith that honored the wilderness as a place of encounter with God, not abandonment by God, because the wilderness had been where God found him. He left a faith that took the locals seriously, the local land, the local language, the local people, rather than imposing a foreign form over indigenous life, because he knew what it felt like to be stripped of your language, your culture, your name. The Celtic Christianity that grew from his mission was notably different from what was developing in Rome. More mystical, more nature-rooted, more egalitarian. Patrick ordained women to roles of spiritual authority that Rome was already moving away from. More focused on the journey, the pilgrimage, the wandering. What the Celts called peregrinatio, a holy wandering with no fixed destination, trusting the Spirit to lead. That tradition didn't just survive. It shaped Western civilization. The monks who preserved classical manuscripts through the early medieval period, who kept philosophy and poetry and history alive while the Roman Empire collapsed around them. They were operating from communities that Patrick's mission had seeded. The illuminated manuscripts, the sacred art, the integration of learning and prayer and manual labor and hospitality. All of it flowing from a tradition that began with one man on a mountain, talking to God in the wind. And here's the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing that I think is the real message. Patrick never drove anything out of Ireland by force. He never coerced a conversion. He never, as far as history records, used political power to compel religious conformity, which was becoming normal in Roman Christianity during his lifetime. The Irish Christianized differently. They kept their poetry, their love of story, their sense that the divine was woven into the land. Patrick worked with that, not against it. He saw what was true in the culture he entered. He saw the longing underneath the mythology. He saw that every human system of belief, no matter how different from his own, was pointing toward something real, even if it hadn't found the right name for it yet. And he offered them not a replacement, but a fulfillment. That posture, meeting people inside their reality rather than demanding they conform to yours before you'll engage with them, that is not a strategy. That is a product of suffering. You only learn to see the other person that clearly after you've been the other person. After you've been the one who doesn't speak the language, doesn't know the customs, doesn't fit the expected form. Patrick was trained by captivity to recognize the human being underneath the category, and that capacity became his most powerful tool. Now I want to come back to the snakes one more time, because here's what I think Patrick actually drove out of Ireland. What the legend is really pointing to, what took decades of quiet work and cost him everything comfortable and ordinary that his life could have been. He drove out the lie. The lie that the sacred was far away and hard to reach. The lie that you needed an empire behind you to matter. The lie that your suffering was proof of your worthlessness rather than evidence of your resilience. The lie that God was silent in the wilderness, that the wind was just wind, that the rock was just rock, that your life, broken and rebuilt and broken again, was just noise without meaning. That's the snake. That's always been the snake. It lives in everybody. It lived in Patrick too. He tells us in the Confessio that he wrestled with shame his entire life, that he felt unworthy, that he kept waiting to be disqualified from his own story. And he drove it out the same way you drive anything out of a space. Not by fighting it directly, but by filling the space with something that leaves no room for it. Prayer, presence, service, return. He went back to the place that broke him, and he loved it into something different. That's not a metaphor. That's a map. The question isn't whether the snakes are real. The question is, what are yours? What's the voice that tells you it's too late, you're too damaged, you've gone too far? The place that hurt you doesn't deserve your love. The mission you sense calling you is for someone better qualified. That voice has a name in Celtic tradition. It is the adversary of the self, the internal serpent, the one who speaks in your own cadence and uses your own memories as ammunition. Patrick didn't argue with it. He walked out the door anyway. He got on the boat. He went back. He prayed so relentlessly, for so many years, in so much weather, that the voice eventually lost ground, not because it was silenced, but because something louder had moved in. The Lorica wasn't a magic spell. It was a declaration of occupation, every direction covered, no angle unguarded. Not because Patrick was brave enough to hold the perimeter himself, but because the presence he was invoking was bigger than the perimeter. That's the message. You are not too late. Your suffering is not the last word. The place that hurt you is not beyond redemption, and neither are you. The voice that says you're disqualified has never been right about anyone it's said that to. Patrick went back to Ireland. He built something that outlasted everything that tried to stop it. He wrote near the end of the Confessio, an old man probably, tired, still defending himself to people who doubted him. He wrote that he would not be silent, that he owed it to the grace that had found him in the worst moment of his life to tell people that grace was real. Not from a place of having arrived, from a place of still moving, still scarred, still, after everything, walking forward. That's not the story of someone who got it all figured out. That's the story of someone who decided the calling was worth the cost. Every time, even the last time, the snakes weren't snakes. And you already knew that. The question is what you're going to do about the ones still living in you. Lord, I won't pretend I've had this figured out. I've gone quiet when I should have spoken. I've stayed comfortable when I felt something pulling me back to the hard place. I've let the voice that says I'm not enough run too long without a challenge. Today I'm asking for what Patrick had, not fearlessness. I know that's not how it works, just the kind of courage that moves anyway. Fill every direction, cover what I can't see. And if the place that broke me is where I'm being sent, make me willing. I'm not there yet, but I'm asking. Amen.